Good evening. I'm Michael Marr with the Center for Energy Studies here at the Baker Institute, and I want to welcome you to the Shell Distinguished Lecture Series. Tonight we have Dr. Cho-Oon of Shell. He is the Chief Political Analyst, Strategy and Scenario Team at Shell International. And I'm going to introduce Greg Guidry, the Executive Vice President of Shell Upstream America's Unconventionals, and he'll give a little bit more background on our speaker tonight.
Thank you. And good evening. Welcome to the Shell Distinguished Lecture Series in the Baker Institute. Shell is pleased to support this lecture series because we recognize the critical role that sound public policy plays in all our lives. As governments, businesses, and organizations, as countries and communities, and certainly as individuals. We're also pleased to participate in the Baker Institute programs because they reflect Secretary James Baker's commitment to statesmanship, integrity, and bold leadership, all of which we need to meet the unprecedented challenges of the 21st century. I'm particularly proud to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Cho-Oon, Chief Political Analyst from the Global Business Environment Team for Shell. In this role, Cho advises Shell leadership on the political trends and risk inherent in our business. He is also a respected scenarios expert with 20 years of experience leading and participating in country scenarios projects. Through this work, he challenges Shell to think beyond the obvious and consider plausible pathways forward. This scenarios work has provided valuable insight that has influenced Shell's long-term business and portfolio planning and has been used around the world with governments as well. Universities and other research institutions. Tonight, Cho will share Shell's new lens scenarios, is what we call the latest scenarios, and discuss how the decisions and choices we make today can affect the way we live in the future. I'll say I had the pleasure of spending a couple of days with Dr. Chong at the Aspen Institute in Aspen, Colorado this past summer to conduct a similar session, and it was a very lively, high-quality discussion. And I'm sure we'll have the same tonight. So with that, let me welcome Dr. Chong.
Thank you, Greg. Good evening. I know that in America, presenters like to begin a presentation with a joke, just to ease the atmosphere. I'm from Asia, so I have to say I begin this presentation with an apology. And this apology comes from our legal department, and I'm obliged to show it to you all, but fear not, it actually can be translated into simple English. And it makes a very important point about the work that I do and the rest of my team does. We do scenarios, but we don't do forecasting, we don't do predictions. Predictions are a mug's game. What we do is actually to look at the present, at the way the world is today, but to recognize that the world can change and will change in ways which may be difficult to fathom from where we are today, but we must certainly try to understand the different ways in which today will evolve into tomorrow and over the longer term. And that brings me to another important point that I always like to make when I talk about the work of my team, thinking about the different possible paths that go from today into the future. We need also to recognize that they require to begin with an understanding that there are different ways in which we can see the world today. So for instance, my view of this room is one view looking out towards all of you, just as each one of you in wherever you're sitting in this hall has a view of the room And to understand how that room looks, how this hall looks, we need to somehow manage to get an understanding of all these different points of view. And only then can we begin to suss out the different possible paths that we can take going into the future. Now, I'm going to say something, as Greg was saying just now, about the long-term energy scenarios that we came up with last year. But I was also specifically asked to focus in on a piece of work that we've been doing since then on cities. So I'll come to both of that. But I'll just say this, the long-term energy scenarios that we put out within the scenarios team in Shell is only a fraction of the work that we do. But this work is really underpinned by a very detailed energy model, mapping supply and demand going out actually, literally to the end of the century. We take these energy numbers, supply and demand numbers, to a group of climate scientists at MIT, and they run our energy numbers through their climate model, and they tell us what this means in climate terms. So anything I say on energy supply and demand comes from us. Anything that I say comes on climate comes from our friends at MIT. Okay, so now to those scenarios, and I'll go through them quite quickly, that we came up with last year. The first scenario, we called it mountains, and it's a very actually straightforward story. It's about change guided from the top, focus on the long term, very much a slower rate of change globally, governments be taking a more prominent role, and geopolitical rivalries playing themselves out. What does this mean in energy terms? Well, these are some of the numbers that we came up with from our energy model. And the green part of each bar line is gas. And our view is that in a world which is very much state-driven, which is very much long-term focus, we will see gas, a major transition in the global energy system in which gas actually becomes the leading primary energy source sometime in the 2030s. Now, remember what I said. This is a scenario. It's not a prediction, but it's certainly a possibility. And actually, we do still see a lot of coal being used. That's the black part of the chart. A lot of oil. It's squeezed, but it's still there. That's the red at the bottom. And we do see renewables growing. That's the different colors above the black, and nuclear as well. But basically, we get a lot of fossil fuel being used, and therefore, for climate reasons, we do need carbon capture and sequestration or any other technology that helps take some of this carbon away out of the atmosphere. So we will see this play out in a big way, mountain scenario. The other scenario we call oceans. And that's really a world which begins from the other side, from the opposite premise, which is a world driven from the bottom up by people power. This is a fast-moving world full of all sorts of possibilities and potential. It's very unpredictable. It's much more market-focused. And in this sort of world, we will also see a major energy transition, because what happens in this world, you get much more economic growth, you get energy demand ramping up, you get pressure on supply, and prices will climb. And when you have high prices in energy, naturally, people will look for energy efficiency gains. Can I use the energy that I have more cleverly? They will also look for alternatives to conventional fuels, and that's when we see renewables, which is the part above the black on each line, actually take off. And what we have, you can't quite see it there, but from beyond 2060, that dark yellow chrome color in each bar chart actually grows significantly to the point where sometime in the second half of this century, in our view, not just renewables, but solar PV in particular becomes the leading primary energy source globally, larger than any other component on the bar chart. Now, there are a host of reasons why that happens. I don't want to go into that here, and I'm happy to go into that further in discussion. But this is a world where actually it's a world of renewables, it's a world of solar energy, a very different energy world from today, and it happens actually several decades from today. But you can see how the trends actually play out. Two very different worlds, both involving each one of them a major energy transition from today. Neither is business as usual. Okay. Now then we come to something that is a concern of ours, and that's climate change. Now, there is a problem with building scenarios that look at climate. On the left-hand side, you have our emissions trajectory, the historical record up to today. That's the light blue line there. And then where the line forks is where our two scenarios, mountains and oceans, play out. And as you can see, they continue that upward trajectory because, of course, emissions over the next 10, 15, 20 years are already baked into the system. They have already been decided by decisions that have been taken in the past. What we decide today will affect where we go 15, 20 years from now, and that's the part of the chart indicated by that big black question mark. People say we would like to be on what they call a 2 degrees Celsius pathway. That's the pathway that is commonly aimed for by many people who are concerned about climate. But the challenge for us is to set out a plausible storyline that gets us from that very steep upward trajectory into that downward trajectory there. We can get the numbers in, but can we tell a convincing story? That's the challenge that we face. And what we have in our two scenarios, mountains and oceans, are two major energy transitions which get us actually to carbon neutral status by 2100. The problem is that both trajectories and the intermediate one, which is an amalgamation of both scenarios, are way above the dotted red line, which is the emissions pathway we need to be on if we are to keep within this 2 degrees Celsius pattern or target that we commonly aim for. So this is a piece of work that we've taken, this is a recognition that we've come to as a consequence of doing this work last year. And this is a piece of work that we've taken on board in thinking about where we want to go next, and we actually have a project looking at what we call the climate challenge. How do we get to a world where actually we're within what people commonly assume needs to be a sustainable limit? Now, within that, we also do another piece of work following on from the new lens scenarios, the long-term energy scenarios that came up last year. And I want to spend a bit of time talking about that, and that's urbanization. Because we've come to recognize urbanization as a key global trend in our scenarios. Consider this. Over the next 40 years, we will need to house an extra 2.7 billion people. And that's equivalent to building a new city of 1.4 million people every week, or to just set it in terms of in terms which people can understand, that's one new Philadelphia, that's one new Phoenix, Arizona every week somewhere in the world. Where will the greatest growth in people happen? Well, they'll happen in sub-Saharan Africa, especially West Africa, and in Asia, especially South Asia. Africa alone will need 1,000 cities of 500,000 people each by 2025, over the next 10 plus years. Now that's a tall order. The people will be there. How they will be housed, what their living conditions will be like, what their whole life experience will be like, will be to a very significant degree determined by the nature of the urbanization experience which they will encounter. Okay, so we also recognize that urbanization and the way in which we urbanize will be a key determinant of future energy use. You see that here. Cities will use almost 80% of global energy use by 2040. So if we are thinking about how effectively we deal with the climate challenge, if we're thinking about our future energy use, it's in the cities. The cities will be a key battleground that will determine that future pattern. And therefore, we better look at what's happening there. Now, in thinking about cities, I'd like you to think about what I call 3 Ps. And these are planning, pollution, and people. And these 3 Ps are interlinked. Let me explain. So as you can see from this chart, the layout of cities has a critical impact on how efficiently we use energy. Compact, densely populated cities will by definition consume less energy per capita, per person, because people will travel less, and when they travel shorter distances. What you see here is that more spread out cities of the kind you typically find in North America will use much more energy for transportation per person. European cities, which are more concentrated, do better on that scale. And of course, you will have the very strange outliers, countries or regions, I have to say now, like Hong Kong, which because of they are really islands with bits of the mainland attached to them. So they have certain natural boundaries beyond which they cannot expand. And so they tend to be outliers. But basically, I think if you look at the cluster of cities that are European and the cluster of cities that are North American, you see the difference that city planning can make. So planning is a critical component, a critical determinant of this urban layout. And urban planning, of course, has a long history in human, in the human experience. If we go back to China, we're talking about, going way back a couple of thousand years to the Shang Dynasty, when city authorities laid out plans on how cities should be organized. So cities were laid out on grid patterns, and every activity had its proper place. And this was done for reasons of social order and, I have to say, political control as well. What we have here is just a small detail from a 13-foot long scroll which sets out the urban plan of 18th century Suzhou. And there are 2,000 buildings marked there, and each is carefully set out, linked together by streets, bridges, and canals, with every activity having its proper place. In Europe, you had this guy, Baron Haussmann. Actually, he wasn't a real baron, that's my understanding, but he appropriated the title for himself. He liked to be thought of as one, but he did something remarkable. He demolished Paris's overcrowded medieval slums and replaced them with these huge boulevards connecting to new parks and gardens in a way that we understand Paris today. The Paris of today was very much shaped by Haussmann. And it's not just the Paris of today, because what he did was also to influence urban planning across Europe, the Ringstraße in Vienna, for instance, and so on, and further beyond. Frederick Olmsted, who was the designer of Central Park in New York, actually visited the Bois de Boulogne no fewer than 8 times during a study trip to Europe, and was also influenced by other Parisian parks and gardens set out by Haussmann before he actually came up with his plan for Central Park. And planning has a critical impact on CO2, on carbon emissions. So on transport, as I've said, a lot depends on how far we travel and how we travel. Do we go by private cars? Do we use public transport? If so, what type? And so on. So reducing commuting time, improving public transport are all positive measures. Buildings can also be made much more energy efficient to reduce their carbon footprint, trees, greenery, roof gardens. I see a lot of that in downtown Houston actually it's the first time I've been in downtown Houston, and I see a lot of that to my positive surprise. And also lighter colored surface materials to reflect more sunlight. These will all help reduce carbon emissions. So, okay, I've just said the major battlegrounds are going to be in Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa. Let's start with Asia today. And where do we begin? Well, we begin with Beijing. On a good day, on this day in Beijing, the air quality index, as put out by the American Embassy, read 755, on a scale where any reading above 100 is unhealthy and any reading above 400 is hazardous to your health. So that's a scale of the problem they face. What might make China decide to clean up this mess? Well, for a start, what we would say is let's recognize that other cities have been here before. So I live in London, and London, of course, had been famous in the past for its pea super fogs. Doing something about it was, of course, always put off by the city authorities and by the government for endless good reasons, so they thought. But the smog of December 1952 led to 12,000 deaths. And the smog was so bad that people in cinemas actually complained that they couldn't see the screen. So finally, of course, Parliament had to act. They passed the Clean Air Bill in 1956, and that led to a dramatic improvement in air quality. And this is a big political issue now in China today, with the Chinese government very concerned to address dissatisfaction over urban pollution among China's rising middle class. And what are people saying? Well, they're saying something very simple. We need to breathe. And so China's President Xi Jinping has set out a new China Dream, satirizing this song by a Chinese actor, Wang Bo, earlier this year. But it's basically addressing lots of things that they need to pick up on in their drive for economic growth. And that brings us to the third P, and that's people. People want livability, however we define it. It's just getting on within the context that you're in, within the urban environment that you're in. We did some work with the Singapore Center for Livable Cities, which decided that Singapore was one of the most livable cities in the world. Well, actually, I have to say, being a regular visitor to Singapore, I'm not too surprised. It's actually a very pleasant and well-planned urban environment. I live in London, which doesn't do too badly, and London gets a decent ranking. It's not ideal, but it's not too bad. But the point about this chart is to show not just livability, but also how densely people are packed into their urban environments. And the point that is made here is that high-density housing, whether you're in Singapore or in London, does not have to mean low livability. You can still live cheek by jowl with your neighbors, which has its good side and may sometimes have its bad sides, but intelligent planning, tackling pollution, these do a lot to help. Here are a couple of examples I'd like to give. I visited Seoul last year after an absence of many years, and one big thing they were very proud of was a Cheongye restoration scheme to open up an old stream on which a road had been built over. So they took away the road, opened it up, and this was something done by the city authorities against the opposition of local people who didn't want it to happen. But once it happened, it became a huge success. People flocked to it. It actually reduced temperatures in the immediate vicinity by an average of 3.6 degrees Celsius, so very convenient in summer. And people actually started recording new fish, birds, and insects in the area. And paradoxically enough, removing the road, so reducing the amount of road space in downtown Seoul, actually resulted in an overall speed up of traffic around the city. Big success. And here's a potential success, and that's Detroit, as a city where the reverse happened. So rather than the administration, it was more business, or it is more business and society coming together to enact, to do the sorts of things that they need to do, that the public authorities once used to do. So businesses stepping in, for instance, to clean up storefronts, to put in the security and the infrastructure that they need for their business, and to renew the public spaces. We see here one park in front of the Quicken Loan building that is exactly that, renew public spaces so that people actually get out and do things there. And actually, I have to say, Shell is bringing its eco-marathon there in April next year. And this is because we believe Detroit is a city that is beginning, perhaps at long last, to redevelop and reinvent itself. And I could say one more thing about the eco-marathon, because it's all to do with sustainability as well. In downtown of any city, you're not going to drive very fast, so it's not about speed. It's about how fuel efficient your car is about energy efficiency, and it's a competition to find the most fuel efficient car. And in doing that, it gives us perhaps a glimpse into the future of car design. Okay, our scenarios, mountains and oceans, set out two pathways in which cities will evolve. You could have planning from the top, or you could have local collaboration from below. You could have big projects, you could have small-scale solutions. And my sense actually is that we're starting to look at two sides of the same coin. We will need both. However, which energy solutions we will eventually go for, I cannot tell you. This is a question that only time will tell, whether we're going to go for more solar PV and distributed energy systems, or whether we're going to go for an energy system based on a natural gas backbone. These are things that I think we will eventually see, but we need to try them out. So what do we learn? Well, we need to think long-term. We need to balance, obviously, we need to balance diverse objectives. Business, government, and civil society all have a part to play. We see that in examples of Seoul as well as of Detroit, and they need to learn to collaborate. From an energy perspective, I talked about trying all solutions. Clean and green is important. In other words, cleaner fossil fuels certainly help, together with a revolution in renewable energy. Those are the lessons from our new lens scenarios. And one closing thought, perhaps, the rise of global cities. These are cities with a global reach. Think London or New York, and to some extent, they're semi-detached from the countries that they are part of. But they're also cities which hugely depend on services that are delivered locally. They are both above their surroundings as well as very much connected to their surroundings and to their neighborhoods. So on the one hand, you have the pursuit of global markets, global networks, city-to-city collaboration, all sorts of exciting opportunities there. But also, there are problems of income inequality, problems of transient urbanites. What does a London neighborhood mean? People are asking this question when 2/3 of its apartments are owned by foreigners and kept shut for most of the year. How these cities develop will be critical for many people in the urban environment of tomorrow. And more generally, urban development will be key to climate sustainability and resilience. And we will need to address a broad range of challenges, increasing numbers of people, growing prosperity, that will happen, and above all, livability. Thank you. Ken, you made it.
Yes, finally.
It's good to meet you.
Good to see you, absolutely.
Well,
Let's have a
maybe
seat over
for the
here.
benefit of the audience, we didn't have time to pre-plan this one, so we'll just have to take it as it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that'll be
Okay.
fun. A little free-flowing discussion. so.
Okay. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you very much for the insights that you've shared. There's a lot of interest actually on the Rice campus and thinking about sustainability in a lot of different dimensions. And so your discussion tonight has actually been, I think, very welcome. We actually here at the Baker Institute have a major initiative to look at energy and environmental issues in concert. And one thing that I wanted to sort of draw out a little bit in terms of your comments was related to one of the pictures you showed on January 13th of 2013. That's very eye-opening for those of you who've never sort of been to Beijing or Shanghai on a day when they're not shutting things down and the pollution is very, very evident. That's a very real phenomenon. And I really liked how you brought out London 60 years ago. You could have easily said the same thing about cities like Pittsburgh and New York, many years ago as well. And what I'm hoping I could draw out a little bit is a short discussion, in your opinion, about what the solutions actually are for countries like China and their major cities going forward.
Okay, well, as you know, Ken, I mean, it is critically important how China tackles the problem of urban pollution. It's way up the political priority list for Xi Jinping and the current Chinese government. And they will act. I'm convinced they will do so. We've seen that elsewhere, and I use the London example, and you have other examples as well. So history tells us when people demand action, it doesn't matter the nature of the government, it will have to respond if it is to survive. And that Xi recognizes that very clearly. However, the way in which they respond to urban pollution will also have a critical bearing on whether or not the world globe. So I talked about the connection with climate, but the way in which they respond will also have a critical bearing on whether it will be helpful in dealing with the climate challenge or not. So for instance, do they actually start reducing coal-fired power stations and move to cleaner fuels, or do they actually say we will shift these coal plants further inland and just take the power, longer distance? So there are issues around that, and we are hoping for their sakes as much as for ours that they will be able to hit a number of targets and objectives at the same time.
Very, very nice. Yeah, usually this is something
would you accept that, or what's your
I
view on
would.
that?
I mean, I think there's a bit of a misperception in the general public, and I asked the question because I was hoping to tease it out a little bit. But I read an article recently, after the handshake agreement between President Obama and President Xi about climate. It's just a handshake. There's nothing procedurally actionable yet, but it's a good step. But at the bottom of the article, a lot of discussion about CO2. It talked about livable cities and breathable air.
Sure.
And the trouble I had with that is the two things are very different. Because you can actually still have coal combustion with modern pollution controls on existing facilities that are actually on. The trouble there, however, though, when you're thinking about climate, is that can actually reduce the efficiency of the coal combustion unit as well, meaning you burn more coal, so you get more CO2. So it's an interesting conundrum to try to work through.
There are contradictions, as the Chinese would say, and you're absolutely right there. So, I mean, you can talk about, I think they have the technology, they have the facilities to make their coal stations, their coal power plants much more efficient in dealing with, in terms of emissions. But to the extent that there are issues around that which would take a while to go into. But there are complexities too.
Yeah, I guess the follow-on question to that is I actually, and this is data that's available.
No, could I just add? I mean, I think the one positive thing I take out, and I do regard it as a landmark sign, is that the Chinese have, for the first time, in my understanding, actually said publicly to the world, we will start reducing.
Agreed. That's why.
And this is a major step for a developing country government to take, because, as you know, the argument internationally has always been, it's none of my business. You developed countries polluted, you sort out the mess. Forgetting, of course, and they have a point there, but forgetting, of course, that we're all in the same boat as far as climate is concerned.
Classic polluters pay, right, type of issue. But I guess the follow-on question is, and you can see this in data from the EPA for cities in the United States, you actually see air quality has increased substantially since the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, largely because of regulatory acts that were actually put in place, and because technologies were available off the shelf that could be implemented very quickly and at relatively low cost to meet some of the demands by general population. In terms of meeting those demands as they begin to emerge in China, breathable air, do you think that it's highly likely they will move in the same direction? And then beyond that, when it comes to dealing with CO2, because this is a beyond China issue, this is a global issue. What technologies are available off the shelf now, and do you think that we need to have a refocus of policy to really think about major R&D efforts to come up with that technology, which is the magic bullet, if you will?
You know, Ken, I'm not a technologist, so I can't answer your question directly on the technology. My understanding from talking with the technology people is that technologies are available. One is that they cost too much, so we've got to bring down the costs. And we've seen how solar PV, the cost of that has been coming down, so that's a positive sign. And two, of course, getting the political and institutional arrangements in place that bring about these changes. And of course, there is a lot of inertia in our energy systems. You build a coal-fired power plant, it'll be there, spewing out CO2 40 years from now. So for every coal-fired power plant that is built today, that's another piece, there's another weight dragging down the system. So you have to ask yourself, how do we actually get a sea change in what we see today? And that's why I look for signals like what we've seen with the Obama-Xi handshake. I mean, that's positive. It's a small step, we know that, but it's positive, and we need many more of those.
Great. What I'd like to do is open questions to the floor. So if you have a question, if you could approach one of the microphones, we can call on you. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. I thought it was very interesting. What are the people going to do in these new cities so large?
That's a very open question. And my figure, the figure I gave of all those, 1,000 cities of 500,000 people in Africa, that's just a number of people. If we accept the UN population estimates, and that's sort of, people say it could be higher, it could be lower. I won't go into that debate, but let's just take the numbers that are given to us as the estimates, made by the United Nations. That's a huge number of people. And it's a fact, if they are not adequately housed, if they don't have their basic needs addressed, they'll be looking for other things. So that's the question. Are you prepared to accept the fallout, and it could be a potentially quite difficult political fallout, from not actually dealing with this problem in advance? And you and I, we could sit down and we could spell out what those implications are, and they're not looking very pretty.
You've given a very positive outlook as far as energy consumption and sustainability. I'd like to hear you say something about the requirement for water going forward and the shortage of water around the world.
Yeah, so that's another piece of work that's ongoing. We call that the food-water-energy nexus, in the sense that, of course, water is intimately linked to energy production, and water also, on the other hand, is also intimately connected with food production. And actually, we do believe, when we look at the climate challenge, that water shortages will hit much sooner and be more obvious to the way we organize ourselves than any climate constraint that may happen. That comes along, but it's further down the road. So I think you hit on a very important point, which we are studying and continue to study. For us, the food-water-energy nexus is critical, but it's also hugely complex. And the balance that we need to keep in mind between energy, between water and food is something I think we need to be very careful about. Food production, of course, will critically impact all of us wherever. I mean, we've heard the stories about, and these are theories, but how the so-called Arab Spring began with the rise in the price of bread, for instance, and that sort of thing. People react instantaneously when it comes to food prices.
Dr. Kong, I join Dale in congratulating you and thanking you for your talk. That was really excellent.
Thank you.
And I joined this gentleman. I had a very similar question as well, and I know Dr. Medlock shares a very high interest in the energy-water nexus. Mm-hmm. You had on your chart London, obviously New York, U.S. cities, and Nairobi was another city. And I think that water issue is a very different issue in each of the cities, but it ties into energy. Would you say a little bit more about how the water issue applies to sustainable cities by the different geographic regions that you discussed earlier?
It's not for me to say that. I have to say, I mean, there's work that's been done. I don't have it at my fingertips. What I would say, look at a city like Beijing, look at northern China. Recognize that the water table is being drained, it's steadily lowering. You have a big problem. Now, what are the solutions? Well, actually, if you look at Chinese water consumption, if I may say so, I do think they could use water more efficiently, and a proper pricing regime would help actually people make better decisions on water use. That applies more generally. I certainly know it in the context of northern China, but I'm sure that applies more generally elsewhere when you have profligate use of resources. Very often it's because they've not been properly costed. Certainly that's the water issue in China. The other solution, which is something that they've been talking about and may well be doing, is massive engineering projects. So the idea of taking water from a water surplus south further north, and there may be some traction in that. But for me, that is just, it's a bit like a Band-Aid solution. It's applied to deal with a problem without really addressing the problem. And of course, you have bigger issues in China, too, I would mention. One is, of course, with longer term. What would happen with the melting of the Himalayan glaciers as a consequence of climate change that will hugely affect water balances across, not just in China, but also India and elsewhere in Asia. And the other issue that they are currently facing, and this relates to water and food, is the use of dams in rivers, in rivers which actually flow elsewhere. The Mekong River, for instance, which flows through Southeast Asia, and there have been huge difference of view, I think, between China and the other riparian countries as to what extent it's affecting water for agriculture in some of these countries where it's crucially important for farming.
Terrific, thank you.
So hugely political issue there, and it will be elsewhere.
I'm glad to hear you mention the word efficiency when it comes to water use. Most of you probably don't realize this, but in the United States, we've become more efficient in water use. Doesn't downplay the importance of the water, energy, food nexus, but the USGS just released a report not too long ago where they actually talked about water withdrawals, and it was actually very interesting to see that water withdrawals in the United States were as low as they have been since 1970. So that speaks, I think, volumes to how stresses can actually dictate changes in behavior. Unfortunately, there's not really a nice water mechanism in terms of pricing. There's no real market for water. And that's actually something that many economists have pounded that drum for a long time, but we'll see. Yes, next question. Go ahead.
Thanks. So to what extent is the decrease in pollution in cities that you mentioned, like London and Pittsburgh and New York, due to effective policy, and to what extent is it due to deindustrialization? And given that manufacturing has to exist somewhere, do you think that the third world can replicate the successes of the first in dealing with pollution?
That's a very good question. Obviously, cities industrialize, they become much more quote unquote dirty in terms of pollution. And then of course, I can't speak for every city. I don't know so much about Pittsburgh. Of course, it has been deindustrializing. Certainly in London, you've seen a change in the makeup of the economic activities that take place within the city, but it's never been a hugely industrial city. It's been a port city, it's been a trading city, it's been a commercial center. But I think the way in which energy was used, and when you look back at the past, and a colleague of mine did a study as to how the sorts of coal that was consumed in Britain in the 1950s. For instance, they tended to, maybe it makes economic sense, Ken, they tended to export the higher quality, more expensive coal and to consume and to burn the lower quality, more polluting coal and make themselves ill in the process. But that's what they tended to do until, of course, the government stepped in with set much higher standards. There's this saying, an Englishman's home is his castle. And this was regarded as quite radical and revolutionary for the government to go into an Englishman's home and say, no, you can't do this or that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi there. I would like to raise the issue of carbon as a commodity and pricing of carbon. So I assume that in the mountain scenario, something like that would come about fairly early. And my question is that in the ocean scenario, when would carbon pricing take effect, and what impacts would it have, especially on something like Shell's plan for which resources to develop?
Let's put Shell aside for the moment and just talk about carbon pricing, because of course you touch on a key point about dealing with the climate challenge, which is externalities need to be costed. And then you ask in which scenario this happens sooner and which later. Well, obviously, well, in our view, in a mountains environment where actually government sets mandates, it will happen earlier than in an ocean scenario where it comes in later because all sorts of other more short-term forces play out. But it happens in both scenarios. The point is that it doesn't, the effect is not sufficiently palpable to get us to a more sustainable. It actually makes a big impact to get from, say, 6 degrees to 3. I mean, you're talking about actually averting the worst in terms of the climate implications that that may be possible on our understanding of climate today. But to get from 3 to 2, that's much more difficult. As far as Shell is concerned, well, I think I defer to Greg here, but we do actually have an internal price for carbon. It's $40 a ton, and you might say it should be more or whatever, but we do that for a very simple reason, because we believe that sooner or later, doesn't matter mountains or oceans, it's going to come in. And so we set our projects on that internal price.
Thank you.
While doing the global MBA program at Duke University, I had the opportunity to spend some time in Shanghai. One of the things that was very revealing was the lack of large public spaces, obviously motivated by the top-down, approach to preventing that kind of public manifestation. As a political scientist, how much do you think politics is influencing urbanization by comparison to energy or the environment? Thank you.
Yeah, that's when we talk with governments and city administrations, they always say, well, proper planning and so on. And you do see, I have to say, you do see city planners who actually take account of the urban context of livability, implications, and so on. But they don't necessarily do so. And that's why I always, when I talk about cities, I always stress not just the top-down approach, but the bottom-up initiatives, the importance of local communities and people actually making their voice heard and actually doing things themselves. Maybe that's why I use the Detroit example. Maybe there's something there, maybe not, I don't know, time will tell. But you can't have one without the other. That's why I ended my presentation by saying these are two sides of the same coin. You can't have just top-down, you can't have just bottom-up. You need both.
Do you think it is possible in a democracy to have both?
I certainly do think so. You can have both in a democracy. And I will say this also. We talk about autocracies, but there are different types of autocracies. Some, and let me say this, and I say this as a Democrat. I do believe in democracy. But some autocracies work better than others because their leaders actually listen more to what the people want and are just that bit faster at responding than others.
Thank you.
Delightful talk. Thank you. Very insightful. 2 thumbs up. As I was listening to you, I found myself internally asking, is Shell listening to this man?
Greg, are you listening to me?
And the context for that comes from the literature that I've been reading that indicates as much as 80% of already proven fossil fuel reserves has to stay in the ground if we're to have some sort of climate stability. And Shell is putting a bunch of money into drilling in the Arctic, for instance, to find new reserves, where it seems like the better business decision with your insights is to really join with other fossil fuel companies on a crash course of making CCS viable.
Okay. Shall I respond now?
You can
Okay,
respond.
thank you.
All yours.
And you point to, a conundrum that all oil and gas companies face. And let me put it this way. I think it was a Saudi oil minister who once said the Stone Age didn't end because of a lack of stones. And the oil age certainly won't end because of a lack of oil. There's plenty of oil out there. The question is to what extent we can and should exploit it. The point is that the whole economic system that we've built up for ourselves over generations is hugely fossil fuel dependent. And we will move away from it. And our scenarios show how we will adjust and move, in one case actually from a more carbon-intensive form of fossil fuel to a lower carbon-intensive form, in the other case to a breakthrough in renewables. So in both scenarios, renewables do come in, it just takes a bit longer in the first scenario as compared to the second. So we do see these big changes happening, but we also recognize that fossil fuels will be with us for a long time to come. And actually, we do take carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS in short, very seriously. And that's why we have been trying to push the CCS projects around the world. Wherever we can, we keep knocking on government doors saying, take this seriously, we need to do something. But you need to start somewhere, and these things don't happen overnight. You start with a few pilot plants, you learn how to operate them, and then you scale up. So that's how, I'm not an engineer, that's how engineers, I'm told that's how they operate. Things don't happen overnight. But gradually, we will get there. I hope we will. Certainly, CCS is very important for us.
Dr. Chung, thank you. I appreciate the presentation. My question is this: in your model, what are you most fearful of going wrong? I mean, I ask leaders this often the time. What keeps you up at night?
Lots of things. But if you're talking about the energy model itself, which I'm not directly responsible for, so my colleague in Shell, I have a colleague who actually runs a small sub-team that does the energy modeling. And there is a sort of basic contradiction of philosophy when you do scenarios and when you do modeling, because one argument is that the modeling limits your imagination to what is already there, whereas scenarios allow you the possibility of thinking about left field breakthrough solutions that you do not see today. And actually, my experience in the scenarios team is Greg, it's Greg set out when he introduced me earlier on. Well, I've been around a long time, I've been in the team 20 years. And I still remember a set of scenarios in the mid-1990s when we talked about a new energy source, we just called it X, that would come in, and a bit like, it's the end of a Greek play, for the Deus Ex Machina comes down from the heavens and sorts everything out. And we figured this time around that we'd try to be more hard-headed than that. And sometimes, not always, sometimes it helps to set your sights a bit low and then to force yourself to think through what can be possible with the existing technologies. Anything can happen. I mean, I was in Japan last year and people were getting very excited about methane hydrates. Now there are lots of implications of methane hydrates, which have quite destabilizing implications when you think about climate, but they were certainly looking on that as a possibility. We simply don't know what will come at us from left field. But we do believe, given the nature of the energy system that underpins national economies and the global economy, is that things will take time to happen. If you think that the 20th century was the age of oil, oil did not become the dominant energy source till after 1960. If you think the 19th century was the age of coal and industrialization, well, coal actually was well into the 20th century, and the 19th century had a lot to do with biomass. Things will happen, and I do believe they will. They will take time.
Hi, thank you for the discussion and presentation earlier. I was wondering what investments in education need to be made in investments in people in terms of avoiding an underclass development in terms of maybe disenfranchised populations in certain cities developing or developed?
That's why I talked about global cities, because that's a big issue with global cities, where you actually have a transient mobile elite, and yet they depend critically on people who live locally to deliver services. And you have this issue of inequality. It's a big issue here, and people talk about, I was in Washington last week, and of course the in thing in Washington, D.C. These days is to have read Piketty's new book on inequality. So, you know, it's a topic of the day, it's a topic of the moment, but it's a relevant one for what we do to address it. As someone who used to be an academic, I used to teach at university, I do strongly believe in education. I do believe in opportunities for all. So education must play a strong part in, you know, whatever we do. But I think addressing that issue of how people live together is one of the challenges that we will face as far as urbanization is concerned in the decades ahead. You know, people talk about London. Well, of course, if you've read Dickens, London used to be characterized by very high levels of inequality and abuse. But we've gotten better at that, and we need to actually learn to get better still.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to ask you a question about some of your scenarios. Most of them talk mostly about the grid. And I wanted to address gridless energy and what you think about Africa and the possibility of, say, artificial leaf or solar energy. And for example, Total has introduced a microcredit program in some African countries, and how you think that could work.
Okay, so there are a number of things that you raised there. Let me just focus on this issue of distributed energy, because that's one of the big factors we believe that will enable solar PV to take off in the century ahead of us. And that's particularly the case when we look at countries like the ones in sub-Saharan Africa. If they're going to have all that number of people coming up, they're going to need energy, and they're going to need a way to use energy that doesn't rely on existing infrastructure. Of course, you will build existing infrastructure, but is there some way they can leapfrog it? One huge example of success in Africa and elsewhere in the developing world has been the use of mobile phones to cut out landlines. And that's empowered a lot of people to do things economically that they couldn't otherwise do. And so we're looking for solutions that will be in a different space on energy, but could actually work in the same way to leapfrog building all that stuff. I was at a conference in Italy a few weeks ago, and I was talking to a very eminent Indian economist, and he was advancing the same idea for India, for Indian villages. And he said to me, he said, we don't have to go the same way as China, and we can be much more clever than them. And truth to tell, they can certainly be.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask one question before we go to you. She raised a good issue about grid and grid stability and everything. And one of the things I haven't heard you raise is the issue of nuclear power and electricity storage. How do those fit into the two scenarios that you talked about?
So I passed fairly quickly over the scenario stories. As you realize, I didn't go into them in any detail. But if you looked at the bar lines, you'll have seen that nuclear power, which is the pale yellow component on each bar column, grows very significantly in the first scenario mountains, because we believe it's a sort of energy solution that's amenable to government solution, long-term planning, ability to take up costs up front, and so on. So it does grow significantly, but from a much lower base. And the big story, we believe, therefore, will be gas. So nuclear is big in mountains, but in oceans where there's a lot of public resistance to the idea of nuclear, it does grow, but at a much slower pace.
Yeah, Shell is well known for its scenarios. I was wondering if you did a 1% to 2% likelihood scenario where things turn out amazingly wonderful or horribly dire, And on both of your energy charts off in the future, you had some good proportion of what was listed as biofuels. Is that more effective use of current bio-waste, or is that agri-fuels, or what? Thank you.
Let me just deal with the first part of your question first, which is assigning probabilities to scenarios. We don't actually do that because, of course, if you say something is only it's a wild card possibility, there's only a 1% chance of eventuating, no one will take it seriously. Whereas if you say you have 2 or 3 different possibilities and you need to actually to take each one of them seriously, then you have a much better chance of getting traction with the guys who actually have to make the critical decisions on what to do. So we don't assign probabilities. We might talk about black swan events, though actually even with black swan events, I would argue that they're actually perfectly, usually, maybe not entirely, not always, usually perfectly rational to explain. Let me give you the example I always like to give. I mean, it was Nicholas Nassim Taleb who popularized the phrase black swans, his famous book. And he gave the example, to describe what he was talking about, he gave the example of turkey. And he said, oh, well, we have the turkey, and for 1,000 days, every day of its life for 1,000 days, there's this kind gentleman called a farmer who comes to give it food and water and changes the straw and so on, and everything's all wonderful. But on day 1001, the farmer comes, and it's just a few days before Thanksgiving, and only then does the awful truth dawn on the turkey why he has been so well treated for the previous 1,000 days. And Taleb calls that a black swan event. Well, actually, it's not a black swan event. It was always a perfectly reasonable scenario if it sat down to think, why is this guy being so nice to me? It was a perfectly rational scenario that would happen to him. Yeah? So I don't actually accept these 1 to 2%. There will all things, we can say things will happen in particular ways, and if something unexpected happens, we must try to figure out why. What's behind that? Because there's always a reason. The important thing is to try to think that far ahead. As far as dire scenarios are concerned, the scenarios that the world goes to hell in a handbasket, things go totally wrong and we're all doomed. There's a very curious thing I find with many scenario practitioners, which is they love to describe awful scenarios where things go badly wrong, and they hate describing scenarios where things actually turn out very well. And the truth of the matter is, and I hope you agree with me, that the real world is never like that. There's always something we don't like, there's always something we do like, there's always a mixture of good and bad. And the difficulty in crafting a really believable scenario is getting that mix of good and bad into the scenario story, and getting that mix of both challenge and opportunity for our colleagues to think through their business strategies. So there's no world in which it's all opportunity. There's no world in which it's always challenge. There are always opportunities. You have to look for both.
I have to comment, that was a very eloquent description of rational expectations that you just gave.
Thank you, Ken. I knew I was an economist at heart, although I studied political science.
Next question.
Okay, Dr. Kong, Dr. Medlock, thank you for your time. As a native son of Africa, Uganda to be exact, adopted Texan, I've watched with keen interest over the past couple of years. I've seen a lot of discussion about Africa, and it seems the trend du jour now is everyone's having a summit on Africa, the U.S., China, you name it. Working for a U.S. organization, what advice would you give, taking off your shell hat, what advice would you give U.S. firms that, are going into Africa as they have to now compete with, large Chinese institutions, other organizations or other companies from other countries that are going into Africa, and the common refrain you hear, when I talk to folks back home is that, the history of Africa is that, they want to make sure, you're collaborating, you're not just going in there to take,
Sure.
because as you mentioned, Africa has a lot of water, has a lot of resources. So that's one of the common refrains you hear. So what advice would you give to U.S. organizations going into Africa so they don't come up with that challenge?
There's a lot in your question, and I'm not sure where to begin there. And what I would say is this. Firstly, You're right. People are looking at Africa now to a degree they've not been looking at before. People talk about the next wave of opportunity and growth will be in sub-Saharan Africa. That may well be the case. And what I would say is this, I mean, look at the world today. People talk about, as a developed world, there's North America, Western Europe, and I guess Japan. And then there are the opportunities in the developing world, and people always talk about China. And I will not diminish the tremendous potential that is still in China today. But nevertheless, what I do say is, look where no one else is looking. So, you know, if you're talking about some other part of the world, where else would you be looking at? And that's led people, I think, to look a lot at Africa. And of course, Africa has had a history where countries have come in from other parts of the world and basically seen it as a region to exploit. And therefore, there's always been that distrust between countries in Africa who are looking to use their resources to benefit their own development and their own peoples. And are naturally concerned to ensure that this takes place. So I think, you know, this is something I think you need to be aware of, and you need to be conscious of, and you need to always ask yourself, what are the social implications of whatever it is I propose to do in whichever country you're operating in, whether it's Kenya, whether it's Nigeria, South Africa, or wherever. What are the social implications? What are the, am I creating jobs? Am I creating opportunities for people to develop their own capabilities, for eventually a business, whatever your business is, it doesn't have to be mineral extraction, it could be something else. Am I creating opportunities for localization? I think that's hugely important. I come from Singapore, but I'm not exactly that young. And I do remember, I grew up in a part of Singapore. I don't know how many of you in the audience have ever been there. It's a modern 21st century city-state. But I grew up in a part of Singapore where in the school I went to, a third of the kids in my class came from homes which had no running water or electricity. And we are where we are today. So, you know, everything is possible, but you need firm government, and you need government that has the interests of its people at heart, and you need companies willing to go along with that and to see where they can contribute.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one more question, so.
Hi, I was wondering, given the decline that you're projecting with given the decline that you're expecting with fossil fuels and the increase that you're expecting with alternative fuels, I was wondering how you believe that will play out with the political power across the world.
Well, there will be implications, obviously. So, look, I hope I didn't say that fossil fuels are declining, because if you looked at the bar charts, you'll see there's significant consumption of fossil fuels in both scenarios. In fact, in one scenario, coal actually makes a slight comeback. Though in the second scenario, you're right, that actually the focus is very much on renewables. But renewables only manage to take off because high prices force people, companies, governments to look for alternatives to the current energy mix. In the other scenario, which is actually much more of a fossil fuel scenario, where gas actually takes the major share of the energy supply mix, actually in that scenario, which is much more of a fossil fuel scenario, there are much greater concerns, I think, for oil and gas, for energy producers, conventional energy producers, because the actual price level is lower than in the others. So we have much more moderate prices. Price levels tell you a lot because it tells you how much revenue you can bring in. I think that's what you need to look for, and then you can then make your own calculation country by country on how resilient countries are. Of course, if you are a natural gas or oil producer and you've been prudent, you would have built up a significant cushion through which you can finance yourself through a bad period, hopefully to a time when prices will improve again. If you're like Norway, for instance, and you've invested a large chunk of your gains from energy, from oil production into an offshore fund, you will hopefully have funded yourself well generations ahead. So countries have reacted in different ways.
Thank you.
Thank you. Join me in thanking Dr. Kong.
Thanks, Kevin.
I believe there's a reception out front, is that right? Yeah, so please join us for a drink and mingle. Thank you.